Good morning and hello, everybody. I want to invite you to come more to the front. We have some seats left here in the front because this is not going to be an academic talk. We just want to have it I want to create an open space for everybody. You're invited to ask questions during the whole time. And so it's just going to be easier if you sit closer. Hello, welcome. Just come in. This is such a great festival, and just yesterday I realized how rare it is that we all have the opportunity to talk to so many people from different, not just cultural and language backgrounds, but also from professional backgrounds that are all interconnected and intertwined. But people from different professional areas don't often come together, or not as often as we should come together or we hope to come together. And here we have authors, we have translators, we have publishers, we have critical thinkers, we have readers, and it's just going to be great to talk about literary translation and its role when it comes to knowledge transfer. Just here, I want to introduce you to our guests here on the panel, but it's not going to be a panel. I want to really say that we hope for 2 hours of vivid discussion. We hope for your questions and your input, and whenever you have something to say or to mention or even critique, just have the courage to speak up, and that would be great. To my right, I welcome Dr. Wangui Wagodo. She's a Kenyan academic, she's a social critic, she's a human rights activist, a researcher, a translator, and a translation studies scholar. She's a pioneer who has lived and lectured in different parts of the world, including the UK, USA, Germany, and South Africa. She has translated the works of award-winning authors, including Ngui wa Thiong'o and Veronique Tadio. She has translated from Kiswahili and Kikuyu into English, but recently she has been translating a lot of works into Kikuyu. Is that right? Yes. Her own writing encompasses poetry, essays, short stories, fiction, and non-fiction. I'm a big fan, and I'm really glad you're here. Welcome. Next to Dr. Wangui Wagodo sits Paul F. Bandia. Very welcome. He's a Cameroonian professor of French and Translation Studies at Concordia University, Montreal in Canada, and an associate fellow at the V.B. Du Bois Institute in Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at the Harvard University in the USA. His main interests in translation theory and history and post-colonial studies and cultural theory. He has published widely in the fields of translation studies and post-colonial literatures and cultures. Very welcome. To my left, I welcome Gunther Geltinger. He's a German writer of novels, screenplays, librettis, and audio pieces, and he's living in Cologne. He has received numerous prizes and scholarships, and he also translates, among others, Nick Mlongo's novel, Way Back Home. It was published in the Wunderhorn Verlag in Germany. Last but not least, I welcome Ebise Wakjira Rao. She's an Ethiopian-born non-fiction editor, podcaster, publisher, and policy advisor based in the Netherlands. In 2015, she co-founded Diepzus Podcast, which has since expanded into an online magazine, and as of 2019 will be publishing books together with now it's going to be hard. Kitgeveri Plum. Okay, that was too hard for me. She edited the anthology Black Afro-European Literature in the Low Countries, first of its kind available in the Dutch language. She also works as a policy advisor at the Dutch Council for Culture. Very welcome. The title of the workshop is The Art of Literary Translation as Transnational Knowledge Transfer. But what is literary translation for you and for us? My name is Maria Humic. I work as a literary translator from Portuguese and English into German since 2011. And I translate authors such as Masande Stanga, he's from South Africa, Eze Osondu, Imbolo Mbre, Chinelo Okparanta, Adebayo Ayobami, and others. And every time I translate, I'm happy because it's a pleasure, but at the same time, it's always a struggle. Translating is the most intensive form of reading. It's a very intensive dialogue and analysis. One always widens his horizons. When we talk about translation and literary translation, we always have to talk about visibility and about balances or imbalances of powers. Translation supports cultural interaction by fostering mutual understanding and enabling people to access foreign cultures and literatures. Logically, translation also furthers knowledge transfer in a broad sense. The art of literary translation is often underestimated. The translator is obliged to be creative. He is obliged to be a co-author, actually, in order to meet the particularly complex requirements of content-related mediation and linguistic aesthetics. Today, we want to talk about personal and professional experiences that we have and made with literary translation. We want to explore different topics, speak about different conditions for literary production and reception, and we want to use this opportunity to exchange ideas, to look at what is gained and what is lost in translation, and what possibilities we have as literary translators to actually speak to the reader about our experience translating and about the knowledge we gained by doing research and diving into different cultures. So we start off by, we have 2 hours time to talk about all of these things. This is why we don't want it to be just a panel, and we want you to participate in the talk. But we thought we start off talking about literary translation. We need to talk about the transfer of literature and about the different conditions of literary production and receptions in different parts of the world. So I would love it to start off when you could say something about the different conditions of literary productions you find in the so-called global south. And when we talk about African literatures, which I would like to talk about in the plural, because I think the singular doesn't get to the point of diversity. And so maybe Paul Mandia, maybe we start with you, because your research area is also contemporary literature, post-colonial literature, and its conditions of production.
Okay. I'll begin by
maybe you want to take the micro. I think it's
sure.
better.
Thought my voice could carry that far, but it just doesn't. I'll begin by thanking Christian and Eva and the wonderful team behind this organization. I feel particularly honored to have been invited to come this far away during my school term. I've had to do some interesting emails lately to make up for my absence, but I do cherish it. I did not have a midterm break this year, so this to me was like a wonderful welcome break from all the rush over there. The theme here, it's quite interesting, crossing borders, and I look at the sub-theme, translate, transpose, communicate, and I look at transpose, it says something to me about the kind of work we do with what is generally referred to as minority languages or minority language cultures. There are other metaphors that we use in that regard. There's crossing borders, which is what you've used here. There's also carrying across, which Salman Rushdie uses quite often to describe his kind of work, carrying across. There's also transcreation, which is a very interesting concept that comes from the Indian context and sometimes the Brazilian context. Now, these are all conceptualizations that are used by those of us who are, as you've noticed, are mainly academic. I have tried my hand at translating. I do translate. I'm not a published translator yet, but you may be surprised how much gatekeeping I play for some of the translations that have been published, being contacted by publishers to give the last word somehow about the quality and the relevance of some particular references, particular publications, especially with respect to my own area of expertise, which is African literature and the Caribbean literature. So, as much as writers need critics, critics need writers. We all work together. And that's something you should always remember, because there's always this thing about, but you don't write. And of course, it's pretty obvious that the writers depend quite a lot on critics, because getting to know your work, getting to make your sales, getting to get to be out there will always require some very interesting critical input. And some critics have made that a career for themselves. That said, I have worked a lot on issues that relate to cultural transfer, what you would consider to be literary and cultural transfer, transnational transfers, the fact of representing African sociocultural reality in Western languages. Now, these languages are often called colonial languages, which is, of course, it's the case, but I am sometimes, when it comes to this, inclined to take up Chinua Achebe's famous comment that these languages have been given to us under very harsh circumstances. We may not have much of a choice. What we need to do is to adopt them and use them to our own ends. We should use these languages to inflect, to reflect our own realities, because in the current times, we're talking about the 21st century, English is not necessarily, according to that thinking, squarely a foreign language in Africa. It is important, obviously, to dwell and to encourage native languages, indigenous languages translation, which I do encourage, and I will talk about that later. But it's also important to realize that by this point, some of our writers, and you can see the proof so far by the presentations we've had, in spite of our good intentions, our wonderful intentions to hark back to our native languages, which is really quite relevant, quite important, we must not deny the fact. We must not be uncomfortable, or made uncomfortable by the fact that English, as well as French, perhaps Portuguese, are now part and parcel of the African linguistic landscape. So what we need to do, and what we're doing in creative contexts, is to adapt these languages to be able to reflect our own socio-cultural realities. And that said, I'm not going to take too much more time. I'm just going to say that the publishing field is very well aware of this. The results are pretty obvious. You can see the numerous awards, you can see the numerous gains, the numerous successes that some of our authors have had. Not because they try to write a novel like an Englishman. Not because they try to write a novel like an American, but because they try to write a novel, perhaps in English, of course, well, like an African. And that goes a long way. There's something African about it. And I stand by that thinking. That's it.
You mentioned the word gatekeepers, and there are so many different gatekeepers when it comes to literature. And for example, as a literary translator, I always depend on the works that are offered to me by, for example, the German publishing houses. And it's such an intransparent process of selection to me, and it would be great to talk about what kind of authors in the different African countries are getting published, by whom, and which of these works are being translated into Western or European or other languages, to have a notion of the conditions of production of literature, because only then we can understand why so very few books are making it to the European market, for example. So who are the gatekeepers? Are all of you gatekeepers? Are we gatekeepers? Who's the gatekeeper for that?
Well, I mean, again, probably I'm giving too much weight to the term. I suppose what gatekeeping here simply means is that before a book gets into to be published, they would seek the input of an expert, someone they consider an expert, to determine the quality of the book. Now that again is quite interesting in the sense that, for the most part, they try to determine how well that particular book reflects the context, the socio-cultural context it is dealing with. How well are the representations reflective or ideal for what it claims to do? It is not necessarily a question of judging. We should not overlook the artistic aspect of it. The artistic aspect of it is very interesting. It is not merely anthropological. It is not merely the sociological aspect of it, whether it conveys the right culture and all the like. It has a lot to do with how well, in the case of people writing in European languages, how well they have been able to bend that language, get that language to inflect the linguistic and sociocultural realities of the context. One phenomenon that is pretty obvious in writings coming out of Africa, it is not always the case, but especially with modern writing. But all across, oral tradition has played a very major role. The presence of oral narratives and all that. How do people weave this into English? Something that is so embedded in its own culture. How is that woven into a foreign language, or let's call it, a non-African language per se? And the techniques, the ways of doing that, really do matter. And we will discuss that in terms of issues concerning whether you need to footnote things, whether you need to do glossaries, whether you need to explain things to others, and so on and so forth. That is a very leery concern about how much of that is done and how much of that involves the creative aspect of the work. That's as much as I can say for now. It's yeah.
Go ahead. I would like to also expand on what you said and answer your question. I think when we speak of gatekeeping of African literature, it happens in the West. Mm-hmm. We can't pass the fact that before anybody's published, you have to go through a white established scout in the West, mostly UK, US, and of course for French speaking in France. And then you have the white publishers. It's something that we can't, how do you say it, not take into account when we speak of gatekeeping. It's not just the editors, it starts from the beginning. I just wanted to say that, yeah.
Yeah. There's a whole agency, actors, like Bourdieu would claim, actors, different levels of actors that intervene in terms of from the production stand all the way to when it comes out. I, for one, in my own humble opinion, act at the last stage, which is basically when the product is there and they want for me to confirm its quality. I don't play the politics of management and all the like, but given my career, given my own expertise, I play the role of judging the particular quality of it in relation to what they assume I do know about African contexts and the literary quality, the aesthetic quality of African writing. Okay.
It's always hard with the microphone switching. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, we heard the talk of minority languages, and I was just thinking, for example, I can only speak for Portuguese, which is not a minority language, but it's in Germany, it's looked at as such. It has over 200 million speakers in Brazil, in Portugal, in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, and even more countries. But they're only like 5 up to 10 novels are being translated into German from Portuguese every year. And that's, it's a disaster. And why is that? Because in the publishing houses, there are not very many editors that speak Portuguese. So they have no way of knowing if a novel is of quality, is of interest. And they depend on the role of the literary translators as scouts. So actually, the literary translator is not only the role to translate the book itself, but to find out which books could be of interest, and sometimes, for example, in my case, if you find something that's language-wise or like stylistic, very expressive and interesting, you often, find editors that say, okay, this is a very different traditional approach. The author is not known, and there are so many obstacles. And when you think of this, even for this huge, the language with these huge speakers, you get an idea of how difficult it is for smaller languages to be published in Europe. Dr. Wangui Wagodo, you translate from, for example, Kiswahili and Kikuyu into English. So you're one of the few you can actually read the novels in the original. You can talk to publishers. So what is do you see yourself as somehow scout, someone who has the responsibility to talk to publishers in Europe or in the US and the Western world about works they cannot judge the quality of?
I think, thank you very much, first of all, for this invitation. It's particularly special for me because I've been working as a promoter of African literary translation, probably is it on? Yes. Yes, thank you. So this is particularly special for me because, as some of you might know, I've been working as a promoter of African literary translation for the last nearly 30 years. So to have company and to have a festival like this when I'm not on the promoting side is really very special, and Bibi, who's here, will tell you it's rare that I'm sitting on this side because I've been sitting on the other side trying to get events like this to happen. So I'm very honored to be here and to be in such amazing company. As a curator of literary translation for Africa, I can tell you that this is a very, very rare event. And I know this terrain very well, and as Paul and some of you know, I'm also a scholar in this field. So it goes beyond being a scout. I started as a translator, as you said, of Gugi's work 35 years ago. I translated Matigari, but I was very alone. I was the early people in my generation to translate from African languages, and then I had no company. So I decided to spend time. I could have shot off and gone on to translate by myself, but I decided creating an ecosystem for myself, for selfish reasons, was as important as me translating. And I'm very happy to see that this is now changing. So it's a gatekeeper with a very big key. But also, I've been, like Paul, a gatekeeper with a smaller key. I've been working, and I wanted to say my case is different because I published my work in Kenya first with East African Publishing House, which has been a pioneering publishing house with Henry Chakava, who you know also suffered for translating my book, which was jailed. It was banned and removed from circulation. So we've been aware of the politics of gatekeeping and translation because of the Kenyan context, which is very special. Books have been published in African languages in Kenya since colonial times. So there wasn't something spectacularly new. What was new is the shift from Heinemann to East African Publishing House. So I was published by both, and I happened to be living in the UK. So it worked very well, both sides, if you can see that as a translation issue. I had a publisher in Nairobi and a publisher in the UK. And of course, we've seen the emergence of other big publishing houses, and I'd like to mention Africa World Press, which has the largest collection of translations. He's based both in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, in the United States, and now Kasahun Chekole is functioning from South Africa. And he has the largest collection, to my knowledge, of modern literary translation, both ways, African, into as many African languages as possible. So the publishers themselves, Bibi here herself, is pioneering. I think many people don't know that the African love stories that were published in 2015 was a groundbreaking publication of translations where the writers wrote in their mother tongues. They wrote in English and then had the works translated into their mother tongues. But what is even more exciting for her as a gatekeeper, she went on to use other medium of publication, and that was a first audio-visual publication. So this is also bringing it to this age. There's also been Ayebia, Nana Ayebia, who's a black publishing Ghanaian woman in the UK, and she also published my work with Véronique Tadjou from À vol d'oiseau, from French to English, both with Heinemann and with her own publishing house. And so we don't need to be speaking always to the European historical publisher. I've given these examples deliberately because we are moving and the landscape is shifting. And you've seen we've got award-winning publishing houses, Indigo Press, I think, Suleiman recently. There are many other black African publishing, and women too. So we're at a different point from the historical. So I think I'll stop here because I could carry on.
But it's good to hear that the landscape is shifting. That's great. It's really difficult with so many interesting guests here on the panel to give everybody a chance to talk a little about their professional and personal experiences. Gunther Geltinger, you translated Way Back Home from Nick Mlongo into German. And how was that? Did the publisher get in contact with you, or was this one of the cases where you discovered this novel and the author, and you thought to yourself, this novel needs to be translated into German, and you worked as a promoter, like we just heard of?
So actually, I came to the translation of Nick Mlongo's novel by accident because I was occupied. I was busy with my own novel, which was set, or my new novel is set in South Africa, and I had a scholarship in South Africa. I spent a few weeks in Johannesburg. It was an exchange of a foundation in Germany cooperating with Stimmen Afrikas, Christa, and I had the chance to make some research for my novel. And during this time, I met Nick, and the foundation was working together with the small publishing house Wunderhorn in Germany, which has a random phenomenon of publishing, especially African voices, and especially I have to point out this African black voices.
Well, actually, it's one of the few German publishing houses. I just want to add that that has its own scout or two own scouts, one in South Africa and I think one in Nigeria, and so this is very rare.
It was an experiment because I'm not a professional translator, I'm an artist, I'm a writer. I am occupied the whole day by writing with translation, but not with translation of a foreign language into the German language, by translating world, translating experience, translating my own concept of the world. And so I met Nick, and our topics met, and I said, okay, I will try to translate it. And it was a kind of experiment because it was my first contact with African literature, and it was such a kind of gate into it. And well, it was a very intense work, and I'm sorry about the fact that in German only African voices are published which are known on the world market. So you know Teju Cole, you know Noval Bulawayo. They are important African voices in the German market, but what I miss is the native languages, the people who can tell stories from the inner country, because Teju Cole lives in New York, Noval Bulawayo, I think, in Paris or in Europe. So they have a distance view on the African continent. And what I miss, and this is made possible by Africa Wunderhorn, is to focus on random phenomena in the African continent. It's not only publishing the names you know because they are successful in the global context. There is a chance, and I think here we must develop. The German market is a bit, well, let's say, lazy in focusing on the voices which have something common, so which are successful on the American market. And Nick was an example of a very random voice, and I'm a random voice in Germany as a writer. I'm not known, I'm a bit known, but I'm not as successful as my name could be a label for the translation of Nick's novel. It was the meeting of two outsiders. Maybe.
And I think a very important aspect that you just mentioned is that literature or culture in general is unfortunately always linked to economical conditions and parameters. So the publishing houses, you know, when you get there and you talk to them and you have very interesting books that you think should be translated, of course they look at the numbers. That's the first thing. It's not the only thing they're interested in, but it's always a very important aspect of the whole thing. So that makes it very hard.
Yeah, and we have to change the landscape of the of the gatekeepers. This is our task to support, maybe by government support, the random publishing houses who find those voices, because my publishing house, Surkamp, is focused on the big African voices. They make brilliant work by publishing the new post-colonial philosophers, but that's the theory context. What I am interested in is the voice, not the theory of the African continent.
You mentioned Teju Cole and how successful he is, for example, in Germany, and that brings me to an aspect you brought up, ABC. Before the panel, I asked everybody to give me some input on maybe questions that we could explore during the talk, and you wrote something that would be of
interest is the point of cultural departure for translators regarding African and other global South works. And you said, is it only the Western literary canon? And I think I just brought this up thinking of Teju Cole. I think one of the aspects why he's so successful is that so many critics find themselves with their own cultural background in what he writes, because all the intellectuals and all the writers and painters and composers he mentions in his work, they're all European and Western. And so when a German journalist reads his work, he totally relates to the things he reads, and that I think that's part of his success, and that's the question you raised.
Yeah, and I would like somebody to answer my question. Thank you for having me, by the way. I feel I'm very honored to be amongst you people, because I'm just like you, Professor Ongui. I'm used to being on the other side of the table. I'm used to organizing and not being part of a panel, so it's a great honor. Also, my point of departure is also slightly different, because I was an editor of nonfiction, serious nonfiction in the Netherlands for 7 years, and it was mostly popular science, so the question of translating minority languages was never an issue until I acquired Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, a translation. That's when I was confronted with how do we translate certain words into the Dutch, and not without keeping it as true to the text and not using colonial language, which is still prevalent in the Dutch. That was my first interaction with the world of translators. And in the Netherlands, there are hardly any non-white translators. So what I did was, like, before I'd say it like this, these are the conditions under which you're supposed to translate. So I took the rein in my hands. Like, if you don't agree to this, then I'll find somebody else. That was my way of keeping the work intact. That was my very first interaction with translation. So I'm less first immersed in the world of literary translation than you all are. I just wanted to say that. But coming from a country, the Netherlands, where it's a small market, the Dutch literary market it's a very small market, and most of what happens in the Netherlands, like when it comes to African fiction, whatever is big in the US gets translated. And white South African writers, Afrikaans. Those are the criteria by which African literature is translated. So most of the names that we know first have to be famous or win awards in the US and the UK with the Booker Prize with Bernardine before they get translated. So that it's an even more isolated world that we find ourselves in than, I think, the English or the French literary market. So I have a different view on how translation should and must function. I just want to say that.
But I think it's quite similar to the German market, how it works, because like almost 80% of all of the literature that's being translated is being translated from English into German, and all of the other languages make up the rest. So even the so-called bigger languages like French or Italian, Russian, they make up a very small percentage. And I think what you said is the dominance of the American market is also very linked to the film industry. Yeah. Because the people, for example, in Germany and Europe, they're so used to storytelling by Americans, and not just in the book, like when it's linked to the book market, but also when it comes to films and Hollywood. And it's also more difficult for a different storytelling.
But also, I think in the Netherlands, maybe even Germany, things changed after the crash 2008. Because before that, especially for the Dutch literary market, a lot of German works used to get translated, German and French. But now, after the economic crash, they all concentrated on like the big names, big sure hits. And even there is this whole debate going on within the Dutch literary landscape that we're translating less other European languages, forget even Africa and the rest, than just concentrating on specifically American works.
I could also comment on the English market because of the because of the prevalence of English as a language, global language, the translations coming into English are less than 5%.
Yeah.
So you can imagine then where the African literature would be in that 5%. So you usually get Anglophone writers coming through, but very rarely do you have Francophone, Lusophone, especially Lusophone. We don't even know, and I'm a scholar of literature, we hardly know. You couldn't reel off 20 Lusophone African writers, even for us sitting in this room. So it's a neglected world, and even Hispanic, because a lot of people are unaware that we have Hispanic phone literature from Africa, and then the Arabophone is completely unknown to the Anglophone world because of historical, religious considerations. So you think Germany's bad, at least we're getting stuff from America. We are not getting it, partly because most people do read English, and English is the language from which literature travels to other cultures in the world. So, and this is the case usually in Europe for most African literatures. And then there's black literature, so you'd have Toni Morrison and so forth and so on. And then the African writers, even our big writers, don't even exist. You'd go to some countries, I've never heard of Wole Soyinka. I've got a colleague of mine who's a translator in Japan, and they've never heard of Wole Soyinka, who's a Nobel Prize winner, and so forth and so on. So that's the general. Africa is nowhere on the literary translation map globally. So this kind of symposium is very important.
I think what is happening in North America, particularly in Canada, Francophone Canada, I think, is that they are quite conscious of this situation where African literature by black artists are not that known, and they're showing an interest in doing this. But what they're doing, which I find particularly interesting, is that unlike the classic case where those writers who are Francophone would just write in French, more and more they're encouraging those writers to write in their own language and do what we call self-translating. There's a lot of self-translating going on. Self-translation has become a big phenomenon, which means that you write in your own language, and then you try to translate that into French. The reason they do the translation, of course, is that their communities are very small. So the reach of the local, or rather the native, the translation or the writing in the indigenous language doesn't go as far. So self-translation has become very important. And what I like about it too is that as a reviser, because I get a chance to do some of that, you then have the chance to see that they are doing everything they can to put across the aesthetic of African literature. Something that when you write directly into English might get lost sometimes, or into French in this case, might get lost because they do have a good command of French. So the self-translating helps a lot in the sense that they write first in the African language, and then they translate it into French or English in some cases. And when they're doing so, they're bound by the conditions and rules of translating. So they're putting certain things across that if they were just creating, they may overlook, you see, because they do have the influence of the mainstream translating practices. That I find particularly interesting because sometimes when they do that, they are not inclined to do what you would consider to be what Kwame Anthony Appiah calls thick translation. Thick translation has become an issue in the sense that although when Kwame Appiah proposed it, it was a good way to educate the rest of the world about cultures that are marginalized, such as ours. But thick translation eventually became something more of an anthropological exercise people using thick translation to study, this is how the Akan do things. This is how they are. It wasn't as literary. The literary quality of the text was being lost. So novels began to have this quality of something like much more of a sociological, anthropological treatise or document. So in a way, I personally agree that as we move forward, thick translation should be something that we should minimize. I'm not saying we should completely eradicate glossaries and all the like, but we should be careful as to how we use these things, because when we use them, we are basically betraying a certain intent to explain ourselves to people. They don't explain themselves to us. I would read their books. I read Beowulf and understood it. Nobody explained it to me. So why should I be doing thick translation to explain myself to anyone else? So you don't need to give them this on a silver platter. So I do agree that self-translating, with the knowledge of self-translating, and being able to express yourself very well and minimize the use of thick translation is the way to go. Because in a way, the African translators or African writers now would be producing work that is not just written directly into English, where they're sometimes inclined to display, if you want, how well they know English. And so anyway, this is just a suggestion that I think the practice of self-translation, which has begun, can be very useful if translators should do that. Of course, Gubi was one of the first to try to do that. And he had decided to write in his language and then began to practice self-translation after that. There was the need to self-translate after all. So it's something to think about.
I'll add to this because it's coming at a very good point, because Gugi had translated his play with Gugi Wamiri, I'll Marry When I Want. But at that point, when translations were taking place, the translators are not even acknowledged. If you look at those texts, the African texts were just translated and the translators weren't paid, they weren't recognized. And I think, and I say this humbly, that I think when I came on the scene with Gugi's work as the translator, before he started self-translating, I was 23 years old, very naive, but I had the common sense to ask for a contract, and I had the common sense to ask to be named as a translator of the work, and my presence brought the attention of the world to translation. Translation had been going on in African languages before that Matigari moment, so it was a watershed moment, and I know it because I'm here. From that time, I've been speaking all over the world about that text and claiming my place deliberately, because I'm a translator, I'm a translation studies scholar, and since I was 4 years old, I wanted to be a translator. Don't ask me how I discovered this, but I declared before I went to school before I went to nursery school, I already knew translators existed, and I declared myself to my mother that that's what I was going to be. So I'm living my dream. But I wanted to say something about the environment of readership. If you don't have a readership in your language that engages critically with your work, it doesn't matter who you translate to. Most of the cultures that we read, whether it's Shakespeare or Tolstoy or whoever, they have readerships in their own communities. So it's all very well to self-translate, but the more readership that we create in our own languages, it will matter less. It will matter less who else reads us. I know this to be true. Kasahun published a book which sold 3,000 copies, and it was a hardback book, and it was very expensive, but it spoke to the people's reality in Ethiopia. And it sold 3,000 copies. It didn't need to travel outside that culture, and I think writing to your own immediate community gives you a critique and a community, and then if other people want to read it, we've been doing it the other way around. We write for the world, and if Africans are lucky, they might get to read Tai Selassie or Teju Pope or Chimamanda or Ngugi even. I know for a fact, as a scholar of Ngugi's work, that there's very few of us writing in Kikuyu language because we don't even have the tools to write Kikuyu. And I know Bibi is about to venture more into Yoruba publishing, and you will find that the norms are not well developed or established in our languages. So we had to sit and create a common modern orthography for Kikuyu. We had a little conference in London where we deliberated Kikuyu language in Kikuyu at the SOAS, and we came up with a common orthography. For example, when you want to write an accent, for example, on a U or an I, you have to go to special character in Word, and then so it's very laborious to even get it right. So we're working now on tools and so forth. The more the readership grows, the more then you have a critical mass to say whether a work is good or not, or sociological or anthropological or whatever. But before you have a readership, and I can tell you, all our literature in Kikuyu, modern literature, is probably all Ngugi. Under 30 texts. 30 texts is all Kikuyu literature, mainly 80% Ngugi. So just think about what that means.
Readership is always linked to the accessibility of literature, and I just remember a reading with Bettina Gappa where she said that in Zimbabwe books are taxed the same way as champagne. So they are like luxury goods, and they're so expensive it's almost impossible even for libraries to buy books. And this is just one part of the whole structure that makes it very hard. You wanted to add something to
Yes, I wanted to add something on the topic of the self-translation. As a writer, I asked myself, what happens if I translate my text into a foreign language? We should talk about what gets lost in a self-translation and what could be gained by the translator in a foreign language. So I think the chance of translation is the foreign perspective view on the other piece. So I think the task of the translator is to point out the difference. And I asked myself if I, as a writer, translating my own text, can keep the moment of foreignness, can keep that difference, can enter to cultural dialogue, because translation is a dialogue. It's a dialogue between the author and another author by the meaning of the text. So how can we achieve, how can we reach a point where self-translation is not necessary, because we have the translators here in Europe to translate native African languages. So there are no translators for this. The market does not have translators who can translate Xhosa, Swahili, Shona. So the English translation or the French translation is something in between. It's something which enables the dialogue. But my wish is that we really focus on the dialogue between the translator and the author in his native or her native language, because I think the self-translation is limited, and we have to break through the limits. And in my perception of the word translate, what is in German übersetzen, and übersetzen means also to cross over in German, to ferry across, so to ferry across a foreign shore. So translating means to cross borders, it's crossing borders, and my self-translation could not cross the border.
Can I comment? Can I also comment? One of the things that you said, I don't know what it was, let me look, speaker, that's Dutch, translator as co-author, but I'm talking now about within the European context, specifically the EU, the continent. When you say you're crossing borders, we can't, at least I can't ignore the fact that because of migration, the migration crisis, there's a large Afro diaspora present on the continent. I mean, the largest African diaspora is in France, and then in the UK, Germany, the Netherlands. So when translators translate that foreignness, do you think of like the Afro diaspora present in your country? Because they also want to engage with that work of art, not just only the white indigenous people of Europe.
I also wanted to add exactly this point, that in Africa and in the African diaspora, there are people who speak these languages in large numbers. I live in Côte d'Ivoire, which is a francophone country, and all those millions of francophone people actually speak French and their own languages. So I just wanted to draw the attention to this scholarly concept of the spectrum of translation, because there's a very large spectrum from people who, like us sitting here, probably don't feel this crossing borders because we live bodily from birth to now in multiple languages, so we don't feel that thickness or that elasticity. But for somebody coming newly to African languages, may want to feel that freshness, and the gap might be a lot bigger. And in my theoretical work, that I would argue that this gap can be as far as infinity, and it could also be on parallel tracks. And it doesn't mean the fact that you're close to the language like we are, that you are aware of the nuances, because there are other layers of the individuality of a writer, which you can never know. And even a writer who you translate could even lie to you about their intention, and they do lie. Because they're forgotten. You know, when they write, it's a natural process. So they're not thinking, oh, this is my intention. They just write. And you ask them, what exactly did you mean then? And then they try to make it a bit better. So we must be aware of this spectrum of translation. And I hear what you're saying. And there is a deep value of cultures engaging with. We are not foreign as translators. I don't consider myself foreign to English or foreign to Kikuyu, but somebody else who doesn't speak Kikuyu will be totally foreign to it because it's totally new to them. But I also know in a globalized world, there are many people here in Germany, for example, who speak many African languages and in other parts of the world. So we've got to work with them. I know of a scholar here in Germany, her name is Tomi Adiaga. She's a big African German scholar of translation studies. She's Yoruba, but she doesn't work in Yoruba. So that's the other side of, you could have Africans who are translators, but they are not conversant with their mother tongue, or also emotionally not invested. So you could find a German who's invested in African languages, and an African who's not invested in African languages, so it is quite complex.
I would like to add one more thing to the discussion, and then I would invite all of you to participate in the discussion. And maybe they wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, I have been instructed to say something. It's also something that you said about within the African continent. I think Somalia and Ethiopia, Eritrea would be in a slightly different context, because I grew up in Ethiopia. I was 14 before I left for the Netherlands. I used to read in Amharic. There were books. We have a rich literary tradition spanning centuries because of also religious. So I'm used to reading not just literary fiction, but also like love stories and everything in between in Amharic. And what I realized once I moved to the Netherlands is that Ethiopian literature hardly ever gets translated. Also Eritrean literature or Somalian literature written in Somali. And when we speak of Ethiopian literature, we speak of two American Ethiopian writers. That's what the world knows. And that's my personal peeve. I'm just going to say it right there. And that's the aspect that is forgotten is that in Ethiopia, people write in Amharic, Afan Oromo, Tigrinya, Somali, and that aspect, I think when we speak of African languages and in translation, we always forget my country, and I'm glad that you mentioned Kasamu's work. I just want to say.
All of the different aspects just mentioned, they also bring us to the question, what does it take to be a literary translator? Because, for example, I think the idea I professionally grew up with is that I would always only translate into my mother tongue. I would never do it the other way, because I feel I don't have the means, I don't have the exact feeling for the words, I don't have the spectrum, the nuances that I can choose from. For example, when it gets to humor, for example, it works totally different in different cultures. And when we stick, I mean, like being able to understand a foreign language or maybe even speak it doesn't enable you to write a literary text. It's such complex and it's so multi-layered that I think maybe the ideal way of rethinking literary translation, especially from African languages, would be a co-work. You know, then you would need two people, maybe one who speaks Kiswahili and could do like an interlinear version or something that's very close, or giving you references to African classics or whatever's in the book. And then you need someone that speaks whatever language you want to translate into as a mother tongue, because he knows how does a baby talk, how does a young man like 15 talk to his mother, or then you have all of these aspects, and then it would be my ideal way of rethinking literary translation. We want to open up, and please, yes.
Can I say a word about that before we get to that? I just want to. Can I say a word in relation to that? It all depends on what we are, who we're talking about. I mean, again, like I said earlier, most of the translators, African translators, particularly those in the diaspora, who do self-translating, they are very, very conversant in both languages. The language of schooling is English or French, so I don't think they're going to need somebody called a native speaker to do it for them. They can do it themselves. See, they just happen to have that advantage of having a mother tongue and being able to have a good command of the other language. But what I'm pointing out is that they are not out to be exactly like the other colonial language speaker, or rather the so-called standard language speaker. They are looking to be able to use the English or the French in a way that reflects their Africanness, in a way that the language becomes African. So they're not looking to write like a typical English writer. They're looking to use English, which is, again, like I said earlier, has become part and parcel of African linguistic landscape, to be able to write the African reality in English. So in that case, they will not necessarily need someone else to help them out with moving from their native language to the global language of publication. So the point I'm making is that what they're doing is exactly the kind of thing I call in my book, Translation as Reparation. What they're doing is basically using English, which is the adopted language, which has become part of their language, as a way of putting across, again, not only the literary quality of their work, but also, if you would allow me, the ideological importance or the ideological significance of writing in that language that they have adopted. So they are subverting the language. They are doing what we call linguistic experimentation with the language. They're doing all kinds of things that may be very difficult for a non-African writer to be able to emulate. It could be very difficult for somebody to say they are English, they want to translate his African work. It may be more difficult for them to emulate that than an African who is very versed in both languages. All that experimentation, all that subversion of language, all that strategy to be able to have inflections of African reality within the text in the colonial language, that can be well done, I believe, mostly by African writers. That's why I do have a problem with groups like Heinemann or all the other groups in Europe who think that they are translating French literature into English, French African literature into English, translating Bayard or Betty. They're looking for standard, French writer. It becomes a bit more complicated for them, honestly. It is complicated for them. I've been reading those things with my students, and you can see a lot of flaws that are due to lack of cultural knowledge. Lack of aesthetic knowledge. When I say aesthetic, I'm referring again to the kinds of things that oral tradition brings to our writing. They don't grasp that. But those publishing houses would go for the best French, translators, best French this, best French that, but they don't have the ability to do all those things. So again, briefly put, I think it's important to realize that we're living in a world where, especially with the global reality we have now, the movements of people, globalization and all the like, there are young men of African descent who write in their language, but who are just as good writing in the European language. And those guys are usually a bit more better placed to handle that kind of work.
But my point was not about ability. My point was about the reverberation chamber of a translation. So the room of the echo is much more bigger if you bring together the African writer and the German or the English. So it's about the inscribed dialogue, the inscribed cultural dialogue, what I wanted to point out, not the abilities.
You wanted to add something? Yes, I would like to open up. Actually, we wanted to be open the whole time, but yes, please.
No, you don't have. I'm so sorry.
You can come here. You
don't have a mic.
It's a small room.
There you go.
No, you can use them.
We can hold
Here. No, you can hold this.
Thank you very much.
Sorry. Okay, here. Moderator. We're handling the mic.
Just go ahead. Thank you. Mine is more of a comment probably than a question. And to just also say that I'm really excited that we are having this conversation in the way we are. I keep thinking from the panel we had yesterday to this, the two panels we had yesterday to this panel, that maybe each panel is a conference in itself, and that 2 hours they're too few for this kind of discussion, but we must start somewhere. I'm also aware of that. I also I'm fascinated by the fact that the discussion has brought out how dense and how complicated and how complex and how intricate this whole subject is. I also realize from what you're saying that depending who is translating, there is real dictation of transfer of knowledge. You kept saying it again and again. Who dictates the transfer of knowledge as far as translation is concerned? And that's a very big issue. I don't want to go into it just now, but I just realized that it's something that you brought out that's very interesting. First, when I was much younger and started to write, I decided to write English and not translate. And I would write in Luganda and not translate. Because I didn't think it was possible to translate. That is how I thought, until my professors really encouraged me to translate. I remember my first translation. I've read it a number of times at conferences. It's a poem that I wrote in Luganda. It's called Amasogo, which means my eyes. And then I translated it, self-translated. But as years went on, a professional translator also translated. So there are three versions. The Luganda version, my self-translated version, and the professional translator.
What was your favorite?
It's hard to say, but what led to the professional translator is that people kept saying that my translation, the Luganda was one poem and the English was another poem. Yeah, there were two, in their estimation, two different poems that were working with the same ideas. And so then came in the professional translator. Because when I translated, I was translating the notion, the ideas. I was translating the images, not to give the one image in Luganda to English, but to try to find an equivalent of that one image in Luganda to English.
But I think that's exactly what we want. You did a great job, because especially when it comes up to poetry, we talk of rewriting, and also a big idea in translation is finding an equivalent effect or impact that the work has. And sometimes in another language you need another language-wise another means. You need to work it differently. You need another picture, like you said. So I think your approach is very close to what I think a translator should do.
You have to decide.
So I just wanted to weigh in. First of all, thank you all very much. In some respects, I think that Professor Bandia and Gunter, it's apples and oranges. We're talking about, it's not actually the same thing we're saying, I don't think. I think for those who wish to self-translate and who feel equipped to, and particularly in genres like poetry, where I think that's the sort of the pinnacle of difficulty in terms of translation, I think that's great and that's fine and it should be encouraged. But at the same time, I would hate for people to think, you know what, translators don't exist, they aren't being nurtured, so I guess I have to translate. And I'd hate the world to think that as well. Oh, you speak French or you speak English, so you translate. And this is where we come into issues of power as well. So, you know, I have been lucky enough to attend some writing residencies. One writing residency that I attended was a place in New York called Ledig House. And it's known for translations. It has writers go and it also has translators who go. So one of the things that I observed is, you know, many Europeans will get together and they'll have these long sessions with translators and like really in-depth work, and you get like fantastic translations. And you know, how wonderful it is for an author, so for an author to be able to work closely with a translator and to get the very best translation. If that's, you know, if you want to self-translate, fine. But I don't think it should be a default that you self-translate. And I think we really should be looking at trying to nurture and cultivate, you know, working within the communities of those who speak languages fluently, bringing up these translators. This is urgent work, it seems to me.
Yes, thank you.
I think there are a range of issues there, and the main one is the question of historical power. As you saw, as we were saying, the earlier writers were mainly translated by European translators, and it wasn't absolutely necessary. There was this notion of mother tongue, first language. which has been discounted because people live in these communities. We speak English, we're scholars of literature, like anybody else, so the professionalism matters a great deal. But also, there's the whole notion of the desire, particularly of Europe, more and more increasingly in the decolonial movement, of people wanting to undo the historical harm by offering their services to translation away from the colonial model, which insisted only on Europeans publishing African translations. But it's rare. We're still in that very gray area of what the real power relations are. So you find that most of our leading African writers, apart from writers like Ruki, even the French writers or other language writers, they're often offered to white translators, although they are African translators. So there are issues of power, mainly because it was white men, then white women, maybe if you're lucky, a black man, and then maybe if you're very lucky, a black woman, in that order, and usually older people like myself. So there are issues, genuine issues of power, but we cannot discount the desire of European translators who have something to offer, but it's very difficult unless you speak about it. You speak openly about this question of power, then it remains hidden. And some translators are very famous, so you may want them, because your work will get a bigger reach, even if they are racist or whatever, or sexist. You may want that particular one, because they are known all over the world, and so forth and so on. So there are big questions here, but I like this idea of collaborative translation. It's something that I'm interested in, because it allows those other conversations to take place. I've been very lucky in all my work that I've done. I've been able to workshop my work with the authors, and even where you speak the same language with the author, as I said, it's not always evident, because our languages are still in their infancy. Like Gugi and I live 12 kilometers from where he was born and where I was born, but he writes a language, because it's not a written language, it's not recorded. We have to work out what words mean, because they're so local. You have family language, you have village language, you have wider district language, then you have the big Kikuyu language. One man who wrote poetry in Kikuyu read me his poems. He might as well have been reading Chinese to me, and he was speaking in Kikuyu. So this collaboration is important, even within African translations.
Just to add to that, it wasn't at all an attempt to play down the importance of professionalism. I train translators, that's how I earn my living. I'm in a translation school. I'm a professional translator myself with the various credentials and members of the various ordres de traducteurs. So it was not at all in terms of thinking of allowing people, because they are creative, to write in their native languages and then simply produce self-translations and that become published documents now. I think what I had in mind was the fact that it is quite interesting for anybody who wants to put out the creative work out there to be able to benefit from their own intrinsic cultural knowledge in their language, to write things up, because in a way you can only do very well with the language if that language is your mother tongue to begin with, if you can write properly with it. So when they do work like that, they have work that they do in their mother language, and these are people who know English and French very well, in my case. It gives them the ability to really have that creative input that could have been hampered. I mean, to do away with that obstacle of having to negotiate that in a foreign language. So once they have that, then there's this stage where you try to translate that, self-translate that into English or French. But of course, at that stage, there's no harm in needing help. There's no harm in working with professionals. Of course, they do work with professionals. Sometimes some of them have worked with me and requiring my input about their translation choices and all the like. And at times, when they work with professionals, as Gugi put it, one of the strategies is also to look for those professionals who are well known by the Canadian Governor General Awards group. Because if you work with one of those and you produce a good, book, then you're sure to be shortlisted. So these are all strategies that come across. So in any case, basically what I'm saying is collaboration is the word. They do collaborate with professional translators. I encourage them to do so because I want my students to have work, usually too. And so they don't just produce work in their native language, have it in French, and then start. By the way, they wouldn't even have the means to publish it that way, you see. So they do have professional input, very much so. I was also going to talk about the fact that this became very important, particularly in the immigrant communities, so diaspora, in terms of this whole concept that the Francophone world has about marronnage, n'est-ce pas? Marronnage, meaning the fact of fleeing, taking a tangent away from the mainstream, getting away from the grips of colonial settings, colonial, if you want, impositions, if you want. This concept of marronnage means that you write like the Indians at the time in the Caribbean did marronnage, if any of you is familiar with that, the fact of killing themselves off not to be enslaved, getting away from things. The idea is actually the fact of moving away from mainstream context, so that mainstream context will not determine the content of African or African diaspora literature, so that they are in charge of that particular content. So marronnage means using that language ability that you have, but to use it such that you're moving away, depriving the mainstream from taking hold of your own literature, you see, and it's to make it African.
So thank you so much. Interesting, great panel. A couple of things. I really appreciate what you said, Gunther, about the meaning of translation in German, meaning ferry across, crossover, cross the borders, which is exactly the meaning of translation in Yoruba. The god of translation is Eshu, and it's the ferry, the god that takes you to the other side, to the crossroads and stuff. So it's interesting to see the connection. A couple of words that have been bandied around is minority languages, minority, marginalized. I find it really, and it was coming from you, which is quite surprising, and it's quite problematic, given the fact that we are dealing with European languages, which are part of just 15% of the people like us are part of the majority of the world. So I think we should really be attentive more to language and not to use, even if we're in Europe, we don't need to be using the word minority because our languages are the majority languages of the world. European languages, if we think of the demography of the world and the aging population, the youthful population of Africa and the rest of the continent, the rest of the world, we may not be even talking about German or French. That's one. Two, this, and it's again coming back to you, I'm sorry to be picking on you, okay. But it is this old, consistent refrain and referencing of Achebe's we're going to make this English language our own and Africanize it. I find it deeply problematic because what we're simply doing is bringing our own languages, our own community of feelings and emotions into a language to enrich. What we're doing is actually enriching all of these languages. What Achebe is doing is enriching these languages to so much so that Things Fall Apart have been translated into over 60 languages and nothing in his own Igbo language, right? So I think we need to be very careful when we do that. I'm more interested in how the different ways in which Africans are, how we encourage a literary culture within African languages so that we can really bring the experience of the world now back into those languages rather than necessarily enriching further European languages, because what we're doing is reconstituting the power or the colonizing power of those languages. When we keep saying we're going to do wonders, I'm not interested in doing wonders with English. Actually, I'm interested in how do we do wonders in Yoruba, in Kikuyu, and in all of these other languages. And then finally, I think one of the things we have to be really careful about is this notion of orality, and how the orality that we bring into African text. There are many African literary texts that have no connection to orality. They're not invested in trying to bring an oral narrative into their text. They're really writing in what Henry Louis Gates will call the writerly text. They're really thinking textually, but at the same time thinking about voice, and which is what we heard yesterday when Sarah Ladipo Manika was reading her text, Like a Mule Bringing Ice Cream to the Sun. She was, you through the different characters, you're not saying, you don't experience it as an oral text. You're experiencing the text as a writerly text, with all the different voices coming into being. And we have to be careful not to consign or imprison African writing, African literature into simply the oral literature. Of course, there's a strong tradition of African texts that are very much oral. You think of Sulaiman Adonio's book, Silence is My Mother's Tongue. It is a text that is both oral, but definitely writerly text. And we need to look at what those writers are doing and engage on those literary terms, rather than necessarily always thinking about the oral stuff. I just want to say this.
Yes,
thank you very much for your contribution.
Just a quick response to that. The thing about using the term, which is a very post-colonial term actually, marginalized literatures, marginalized peoples, minority literatures, and all the like, as someone pointed out earlier, it's not in terms of numbers, it's in terms of power relations. It's in terms of global power relations, you see. It's really not in terms of numbers of speakers and all the like. In fact, what's the language that has the most speakers in the world is Chinese, isn't it? So, even the Chinese draw from post-colonial thinking in terms of the power relations that exist between the Chinese literary scene and the Western literary scene. So when we say marginalized, it's often versus the center, which means that marginalized is because these are groups of people, because of their histories, have not had enough.
Sorry, I'm going to have to cut you there. I'm going to cut you there because I'm very much aware of the post-colonial discourse around marginalization and the minority discourse and the power dynamics and stuff. And I'm actually saying we have to, even that very notion, I want to contest it. Just so even as I'm aware that when you talk about marginalization, the very notion of continually talking in terms of minority language, marginalization, in order to emphasize the power dynamics, is to re-inscribe and consolidate the power dynamics. And this is why we have to do away with it.
Right. Well, isn't it the reason why we're thinking mostly in terms of indigenized language writing, which is a very good thing. But coming back to Achibe's position, which is kind of old indeed, of course, but it hasn't changed much in the sense that most of the literatures we've discussed so far in this particular event have been either in English or French, you see. And the point I'm making is that they are no less African literatures, even though they were in English and French. You see, it's good to get into indigenous literatures, but because these literatures that we've discussed so far at this meeting have either been English and French, and they're all African literatures. So Chibe must have a point to think of English as part and parcel of Western, of African reality. That's right.
I've been happy to listen in on this deeply engaged conversation. I was particularly moved by what Dr. Wagoro said about if we want to publish in our indigenous languages, we have to have engaged critical readership. And my question to you in the industry
as academics, as translators, as editors, as publishers, is what are we doing to promote the readership of African books published in English or French, getting translated into indigenous African languages. I'm particularly interested in an example of Ayobami Adebayo's Stay With Me, gorgeous novel. I don't know if it's available in any major or African language. Is that something that we are thinking of as an industry? I mean, are we more concerned with sales, market, what is feasible? Or what are we talking about when we talk about a transfer of culture?
I'm happy to speak to this question, which has been my passion for most of my adult life. We started with the Achebe position many years ago, 50 years ago, in the English language, but there has been a big tidal wave, and it's coming. It is coming. Bibi here declared only last week, I think, that she's turning to publishing in Yoruba. And for me, this is very exciting. She's got the money, she's got the will, she's understood it. And I wrote in my Facebook, she has got it. And that's where most of Africa is turning. I've traveled around Africa, the African diaspora. We have an association within the African Literature Association, a little group that we founded inside the African Literature Association. It's called the Translation Caucus of the African Literature Association. We've been reading our work in our mother tongues or in our African languages without translation, without apology. I don't speak Yoruba, but I'm glad that in there, in the body that claims to be African Literature Association, that we're just a handful of people who care. And it's turning the tide. We've got so many translations now from that little group of people into our mother tongues. I've been working secretly because nobody wants to publish me. They want to. If I said I'm going to publish in French tomorrow, I'll have a queue of publishers. Nobody is publishing me yet, but when it happens, it is going to happen big. And right now, my Bellagio residency, which you'll all hear about, is about a very big book, which I'm about to finish, from Italian to Kikuyu. And I'm translating your poem from Luganda straight into Kikuyu without any intervention. But the tide is turning. There are awards in African languages, especially in Southern Africa. You saw yesterday, what's her name? Zukiswa Warner brought examples of books that she herself has published in Xhosa, in her mother tongue and her father tongue. And she's now working in Kiswahili. And this is the trend rather than the exception. It may not have money, but it's going to happen, and it's what they call in other places the cultural turn, and it's creating those readerships. The governments like of Kenya now have adopted a national African language policy, and those kids will need books. Those kids will need books all the way to university, so it's happening.
I'm talking also from the inside of the publishing industry in Germany. I work with a big publisher, and I'm thinking now, okay, we're going out of this with, you said a task, which is actually a very beautiful word, like Aufgabe, which is the best thing you can take with you from this kind of gathering. I want to say that I think your point was very important, and my point of departure would be, I think our industry is becoming more and more irrelevant, and they are not aware. You said there's a lack of language competence in the houses. It's true, they don't read anything but English, and it's getting worse and worse and worse.
That sometimes then they wait for the translation.
Yeah, they think they read English, but of course it's all. And there is 80% of what is being translated from the English, and even more. And so there's, I mean, it means literally in absolute numbers that they have space for 2 novels a year, which are not from the English.
And but there's a growing readership out there, also in Europe. I mean, in the rest of the world, Europe is a minority, as you said, and there are some things changing and shifting. But also within Europe, there's a growing readership which is not interested in Charlie Rooney.
Yeah.
Give an example. So yeah, and it's both terrifying and but also full of hope.
Thank you very much. There are a few more. Yes.
I just want to add one thing. I think also not just concerning the African languages, but also within Europe. So if I'm speaking from the Dutch point of view, English is encroaching upon European languages as well, especially in the business and in the academic community. In the Netherlands, almost all of the studies that you do in the Netherlands, it's in English. It's not even in Dutch, and the professors teaching in English are not really good at teaching in English. So there's becoming a backlash against English encroaching upon the Dutch language. So I'm also thinking, like, if other European countries all band together and push English away, then I'm sure there's hope on the horizon. I just wanted to say that.
I have one question, a bit similar to you one. I'm asking you, what about the translation in between Africa, the translation from Africa authors writing in their native language to another African language? Because I live, for example, in Italy, and what I like to read in Italian, the music I like to listen to, or the films I like to watch too, you rarely find them in Germany, because there's such a big difference of mentality. And I guess in Africa you have so very different types of cultures, and so I'm wondering how much is the interest in between the different African countries to get to know the literature from another African countries translated in the mother language. I don't know if I explained well.
Yeah, it's clear. It's clear, and when we started this translation movement in the African context, one of the stated objectives was speaking across African languages. But this is a historical process. It's not going to happen. We are all in the shadow of colonial languages. Francophone people hardly read Anglophone people unless they're translated. At this point in history, I come from a unique country where we have a lingua franca, which is Kiswahili, which has a large published tradition, which means that many people, even if you don't speak Kiswahili, at least the Bantu, so-called Bantu communities, like when Susan Kiguli here read her poem, I could hear it in my mother tongue. I could hear she was saying the word ulimi, which means tongue. If somebody says kulala, kula, in our cultures, you can hear what the poem, the story is doing. But there is a move now to standardize a number of large languages democratically. And the only one that has achieved this status for historical reasons is Kiswahili in the eastern part of the continent. And because of its Bantu roots, politically it's easier for Southern Africa to adopt it than if we export it to West Africa. So that conversation is still being had. North Africa has sorted itself out because they speak Arabic, but there are indigenous languages which are not Arabic in the northern part of Africa. There are 2,000 languages. Even Europe hasn't managed it yet. The Finnish are writing in their own language, the Germans are writing it in their own, and we only now manage because of the translators, even in advanced societies like European society. So as the children grow, we will see a growth of multilingualism. There's also technological advancement, which makes it easier to publish and to translate across languages. Like we saw, Zukiswa had the books in 3 languages, and that's just one tiny little publisher. So it's possible, and it's happening. So I think it will take time. It will take a generation probably, but it also requires political will. And as you've seen, some languages like English are very political and commercially political. So they will fight their way into the world. So we have to find measures to also protect and protect our languages, because if we don't, some of them are already extinct as we sit here today, and many of them are dying because all of us sitting here are not first users of our language. We have them, but that's not our language of writing, even old as we are. Am I right?
You're right. I just want to add to that, please. This discussion, this particular topic, very much depends on the region of Africa we're talking about. Wangi just mentioned the fact that they have a lingua franca in East Africa, which is really one of those languages that would cover a wide range of geography. A lot of people can speak that language. Whereas when you go to where I come from, Cameroon, you have a very small space with over 225 languages. Very small space, 225 languages. And even with the effort of the Germans in the early days to promote one, Douala, that was when the Germans still were in control in Cameroon. They promoted Douala, but they never managed to impose Douala on the rest of the country. They just couldn't do it. So what happens is that if you have so many languages and you cannot find a way to impose one of them, Douala, which was the only one that was given script really early, of course, Bamoun had its own script through its own sultan. You see the difficulty. There's a difficulty of communicating across ethnic groups because no one group wants one language to be imposed on the other. Now, so there could be communication between mutual intelligible languages, and there's been that in terms of literature, oral literature especially. But the problem remains that most of the people now have decided to, over the years, since the times of trade, resorted to Pidgin English, because Pidgin English became the language which almost has the same status as Swahili, became the lingua franca of that area. So you would find people from different groups speaking Pidgin English. Even if they are francophones or lusophones and all the like, they would use Pidgin English because Pidgin English has a bit of all those languages. So the point I'm making is that people always end up looking for some kind of a fata communion, meaning a language that belongs to, that they can all understand, and so that they can cope with their communication. And so they communicate among themselves in Pidgin. And when they are writing, they will write in their own language. But if they write in their own language, they're writing in a very, very closed environment. People who speak their language. That's what is happening. So again, the point I'm making is, these kinds of things we're discussing are valid. We need to do things for African languages to become our main focus. But the fact is, we must take into account the geography, the reality on the ground in Africa. East Africa or Northeast Africa has another reality with these major languages that cover a lot of space. Lingala also covers quite some space. But in West Africa, there's Hausa, with a certain group of people. But in Cameroon, we don't have a language that covers that amount of space. And you have over 225 languages. So think about it. That's another problem. Yeah.
I fear that we are running out of time. I'm very sorry. We have one last contribution. Gunther was saying the whole time that he wanted to say something, so I give you the microphone, and I think then we have to find an end.
Thank you. I think it's an open question to you all, and I want to refer to your statement. It's a very important statement. Very important what you said. You are working in a German publishing house. My question, for me as a writer, a German writer, the question for the literary field in Germany is how will we deal in future with the multilingual Germany? Because we are not a German country anymore. We turned within 15 years we turned into a multilingual country. How can we respect and publish the not German voices of our society, because literature represents a society. So how will the publishing houses build up a structure to see those, to not only to publish the voices from African immigrants from Russia, from Eastern Europe. If you send a text to a German publishing house which is not German, you are ignored. So how can we find the voices which are not German but which are telling stories about Germany in their own voices? So will there be a multilingual agent who is a worker of a publishing house who speaks French and English and maybe Indian, or and the question for me is, would it be possible for us German writers to write in English, or must the German publishing house in future have a bilingual program so that we can switch from German to English? These are big questions, but I think the German publishing landscape is very behind our time.
Thank you for these questions. I feel that we need to discuss the questions, or we have to take them with us and discuss them now in the break after the debate. And maybe it's one more task that you can take with you. Thank you very much for being concentrated for such a long time and listening to our discussion. It's obvious that there's a huge interest in the topic, but we could only talk about a few of the issues related to it. We need to continue being in exchange, talking about all of the different aspects that we touched. And I would maybe end on a more positive note, because we talked about all the books that are not being translated, or about all of the obstacles we face. Because you have the book here by Mbolo Mboulou from Cameroon, and she wrote this novel, Behold the Dreamers, which has been published in Germany, and I translated it. And I had the book is full of pidgin English. And I think 10 years ago it would not have been possible to talk with the publishing house and finding a solution to really show that multilingual aspect of the book. They would have said, okay, we put everything in standard German and that's it. But they actually were open to finding a solution and to showing this aspect. And I think this is, for example, a little shift that's positive. So let's end on this positive note. Thank you very much, and let's keep on